Sophie Bennett clutched her boarding pass with one hand and her 11-month-old daughter Emma's carrier with the other as she rushed through the crowded terminal of Westbrook International Airport. Her faded blue jeans and simple white t-shirt were wrinkled from the 3-hour bus ride to the airport, and dark circles shadowed her eyes from another night of minimal sleep. The overhead announcement system blared final boarding calls as she quickened her pace, the weight of her oversized backpack digging into her shoulders. "Gate C14, she muttered to herself, glancing anxiously at the signs above. Emma began to fuss, her tiny face scrunching up in preparation for a cry that Sophie knew would come if they didn't stop moving soon. "Just a few more minutes, sweetie," she whispered, planting a quick kiss on her daughter's forehead. When Sophie finally reached the gate, the attendant barely glanced at her boarding pass before waving her through. "You're the last one. Hurry along," the woman said, already turning her attention to closing the gate. Relief washed over Sophie as she stepped onto the plane. She was going to make it to Minneapolis after all, where her cousin had promised her a temporary place to stay and a potential job interview. After 6 months of struggling to make rent at her cramped studio apartment in Philadelphia, this was her chance at a fresh start. The flight attendant directed her toward the back of the plane. "Row 27, window seat," she said with a practiced smile. Sophie nodded gratefully and made her way down the narrow aisle, apologizing as she bumped into passengers with her backpack. When she reached row 27, she was surprised to find only one other passenger in the row, a man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit sitting in the aisle seat, focused on documents spread across the tray table. Sophie hesitated, calculating how she would maneuver herself, Emma, and her backpack past him. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I think I'm at the window." The man looked up and Sophie's heart stopped. Those penetrating hazel eyes, the defined jawline now sporting a neatly trimmed beard, the slight crease between his brows when he concentrated, features she'd memorized 5 years ago and tried desperately to forget. Alexander Reid, CEO of Vertex Innovations, one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country. The recognition wasn't immediate in his eyes, just a polite nod as he stood to let her pass. "Of course," he said, his deep voice sending an involuntary shiver down her spine. Sophie squeezed past him, careful not to meet his gaze again, as she settled Emma's carrier in the middle seat and stowed her backpack under the seat in front. Her hands trembled as she buckled Emma in, her mind racing with memories she'd locked away for years. 5 years ago, Alexander Reid hadn't been a CEO. He'd been a promising young executive at Vertex, and Sophie had been a bright-eyed college, senior interning in the marketing department, dreaming of a career in digital advertising. Their paths had crossed during a company project, leading to late nights of work that evolved into something more. Something that ended abruptly when Sophie made a critical mistake that cost Alexander a major client and cost her any future in the industry. Now here he was, sitting less than 2 feet away from her and the daughter he didn't know existed. The flight attendants began their safety demonstration as Sophie tried to calm her racing heart. She glanced at her boarding pass again, double-checking the destination, Minneapolis. Then she noticed the flight number, AA287, not AA267 as it should have been. Cold realization washed over her as she frantically pulled up the flight information. On her phone before the announcement to switch off devices, this wasn't the flight to Minneapolis, this was the flight to San Francisco. "No, no, no," she whispered, panic rising in her chest. She couldn't afford another ticket. She barely had enough money to last 2 weeks in Minneapolis while looking for work. San Francisco was one of the most expensive cities in the country. She'd be stranded. Emma, sensing her mother's distress, began to whimper. Sophie bounced her gently, trying to soothe both the baby and herself as the plane began to taxi. "First, time flying with the little one?" Alexander asked, his tone casual and kind, clearly attempting to ease what he perceived as new mother flying anxiety. Sophie turned to him, tears threatening to spill. "I'm on the wrong flight," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm supposed to be going to Minneapolis, not San Francisco." Alexander's expression shifted to concern. "Did you tell the gate agent?" "I didn't realize until just now. The gate number was right, but I must have misread my ticket or—" She trailed off, remembering how the attendant had barely looked at her boarding pass. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing them back against their seats as it lifted into the air. There was no turning back now. "I can't afford another ticket," Sophie continued, more to herself than to him. "I can't afford to stay in San Francisco either. Everything I have is in this backpack." Alexander studied her face more carefully, and Sophie watched as the flickering of recognition dawned in his eyes. His brow furrowed as he pieced together the features that 5 years had subtly changed. Her once long blonde hair now cut in a practical shoulder-length style, her face thinner, her blue eyes carrying a weariness that hadn't been there before. "Sophie?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Sophie Bennett?" Sophie nodded, swallowing hard as she cradled Emma closer to her chest, a protective instinct she couldn't control. "Hello, Alexander," she replied, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside her. His eyes darted to Emma, taking in the baby's delicate features, the wispy blonde hair, and most strikingly, the hazel eyes that mirrored his own. The question formed on his lips, but remained unspoken as understanding slowly transformed his expression. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but neither of them moved. 5 years of separation, of unspoken words and buried secrets, compressed into the narrow confines of row 27 as the plane climbed higher into the clouds, carrying them toward a destination neither had planned. 5 years earlier, Sophie Bennett hurried through the gleaming glass doors of Vertex Innovations, her portfolio clutched tightly against her chest. The 22-year-old marketing intern had spent all night refining her presentation for the Westfield account, her first opportunity to contribute to a major client pitch. Her professor had recommended her for this internship, insisting that Sophie's creative approach to digital marketing would be valuable even to an established tech company like Vertex. The sleek, modern lobby buzzed with activity as employees swiped keycards and visitors checked in at the reception desk. Sophie smoothed down her carefully selected navy blazer, a thrift store find she'd tailored herself, and headed toward the elevator, reviewing mental notes for her presentation. "Hold. The elevator, please," she called, quickening her pace as the doors began to close. A hand shot out, stopping the doors. "Thanks," Sophie said breathlessly as she stepped inside. She looked up to thank the person properly and found herself staring into the most captivating hazel eyes she'd ever seen. "No problem," replied Alexander Reid, then the rising star of Vertex's business development team. At 28, he'd already earned a reputation for turning struggling accounts into profitable partnerships. His tall frame filled out his tailored suit perfectly, and his smile revealed a small dimple in his right cheek. "You're the new marketing intern, right?" he asked, pressing the button for the 12th floor. Sophie's eyes widened. "Yes, Sophie. Bennett. I didn't realize anyone would know who I am. Your concept boards for the Richardson project were impressive. Creative but practical," Alexander said. "Not a common combination." The elevator dinged at the 8th floor, and Sophie realized this was her stop. "This is me," she said, reluctantly stepping toward the doors. "Thank you for the compliment, Mr. Reid." "Alexander," he corrected with a smile. "I'm heading to the Richardson meeting at 11. Will you be there?" "Yes, I've been asked to observe," Sophie replied, trying to keep her voice professional despite the flutter in her stomach. "See you then," he said as the doors closed between them. That brief encounter sparked weeks of collaboration. Late nights, reviewing marketing strategies, turned into takeout dinners in Alexander's office, which evolved into discussions about their dreams and ambitions. Sophie shared her vision of revolutionizing how tech companies connected with non-technical consumers. Alexander confided his plan to overhaul Vertex's approach to emerging markets. Most executives just chase the established clients, Alexander explained one evening as they sat surrounded by presentation boards and empty coffee cups. But the real growth potential is in sectors just beginning to adopt our technology. Sophie nodded, unconsciously moving closer. That's what I've been trying to say with these demographic analyses. Traditional marketing misses huge segments of potential users. Their eyes met, and for a moment the spreadsheets and strategies disappeared. Alexander gently tucked a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. The office around them faded as their lips met in a kiss that changed everything. Their relationship remained private. Workplace romances were discouraged at Vertex, especially between an executive and an intern. But in stolen moments between meetings and during late-night strategy sessions, their connection deepened. Sophie fell hard for Alexander's ambition tempered with kindness, his strategic mind that still made room for creativity. I've never met anyone who understands both sides of my world, Alexander told her one night as they walked along the waterfront after work. The business realities and the innovative possibilities. Sophie squeezed his hand. That's what good marketing is, bridging the gap between what businesses need and what people want. For 3 months, Sophie felt like she was living a dream. Her internship extended as her contributions to projects gained recognition. Her relationship with Alexander grew more serious, though they maintained professional boundaries at the office. Then came the Westfield pitch, a potentially game-changing client for Vertex, and Alexander's chance to prove his approach to emerging markets. Sophie had been assigned to develop targeted marketing strategies for Westfield's demographic. The night before the presentation, Sophie discovered a critical flaw in the market analysis she'd been given to work with. The data had been misinterpreted, showing potential growth in sectors where Westfield was actually losing ground. She worked through the night, recalculating projections and revising her recommendations. Exhausted but confident in her corrections, she arrived early to update the presentation files. In her haste and fatigue, she uploaded her revised version without notifying the team of the substantial changes. When Alexander began the presentation, he found himself speaking to slides with completely different data than what he'd prepared for. He stumbled, tried to adapt, but the discrepancy was too significant. The Westfield executives exchanged confused glances as the pitch unraveled. Afterward, in the empty conference room, Alexander confronted her. "What happened, Sophie? Those weren't the numbers we finalized." "The original analysis was wrong," she explained desperately. "I found the error last night and fixed it. I was trying to help by completely changing our strategy without telling anyone." His voice rose with frustration. "This account was critical, Sophie. Years of relationship building gone because you decided to play hero instead of following protocol." "I was doing my job," Sophie fired back, tears threatening. "Would you rather I presented incorrect data?" "I'd rather you communicated with your team." Alexander ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't college where you get points for individual brilliance. This is business. We succeed or fail together." The argument escalated. Hurtful words were exchanged. By the end, Sophie had resigned her position, and Alexander had retreated behind a wall of professional detachment, suggesting perhaps they'd both mistaken workplace proximity for something deeper. 2 weeks later, Sophie discovered she was pregnant. She called Alexander's office repeatedly, but his assistant insisted he was unavailable. She emailed, explaining she needed to speak with him urgently about a personal matter, but received no response. Finally, she went to Vertex headquarters, only to learn Alexander had left for a 3-month assignment establishing their London office. The receptionist, noting Sophie no longer worked there, refused to provide contact information. Sophie left a sealed letter with his assistant, including her new phone number and the news about the pregnancy. She waited weeks for a call that never came. Eventually, Sophie concluded Alexander had received her letter and made his choice, his rising career over an unexpected pregnancy with a former intern who'd cost him a major client. With her professional reputation in tatters and no support from the baby's father, Sophie withdrew from her final semester of college. She moved to Philadelphia, where a friend offered her a place to stay, took a retail job, and prepared to become a single mother. She promised herself she would never again let Alexander Reid affect her life. But now, 5 years later, at 30,000 feet, that promise lay shattered as Alexander stared at the living proof of what he'd left behind. "She's mine, isn't she?" Alexander's question hung in the air between them, barely audible over the steady hum of the jet engines. His gaze remained fixed on Emma, studying her features with an intensity that made Sophie instinctively tighten her hold on her daughter. Sophie glanced around at the nearby passengers, most engrossed in their own activities, headphones on, screens, illuminated, or already dozing despite the early stage of the flight. Still, this was hardly the place for such a conversation. "Alexander, Don't lie to me, Sophie," he interrupted, his voice low but firm. "Those eyes, they're exactly like my mother's, like mine." Emma chose that moment to reach out a tiny hand toward Alexander, babbling softly as she often did with strangers. The gesture seemed to knock the wind out of him. He leaned back in his seat, running a hand through his meticulously styled dark hair. "I left you a letter," Sophie finally said, keeping her voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions threatening to overwhelm her. "I came to your office, I called, I emailed, I did everything short of skywriting to tell you about her." Alexander's expression shifted from shock to confusion. "What letter?" "I never received any letter, Sophie. I never heard from you after that." Day in the conference room. The flight attendant paused at their row, her practiced smile faltering slightly as she sensed the tension. "Can I get either of you a beverage? Just water, please," Sophie replied, grateful for the interruption. "Scotch." "Neat," Alexander said, without taking his eyes off Sophie. When the attendant moved on, Alexander leaned closer. "I never knew, Sophie. I swear to you, after the Westfield disaster, I was sent to London to salvage what was left of our European expansion. When I returned 3 months later, you were gone. No one knew where." Sophie scoffed quietly. "I left a sealed letter with your assistant, Melissa, I think her name was. Blonde, always wore those designer glasses." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Melissa Dawson. My director's niece, the one who was trying to undermine everyone she saw as competition for her advancement." He rubbed his temples. "She was let go about a month after I returned for mishandling sensitive documents. The implication hung between them. Had Melissa deliberately withheld Sophie's letter? The possibility that Alexander truly hadn't known about Emma created a hairline fracture in the wall of resentment Sophie had built over 5 years. "You expect me to believe you would have cared?" Sophie asked, her voice tinged with the bitterness of countless nights spent alone, wondering how he could have abandoned them so completely. The rising star of Vertex, on track for the executive suite, suddenly saddled with an unplanned baby and the intern who tanked his biggest pitch. Alexander's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't know what I would have done because you never gave me the chance." He took a breath, visibly composing himself. "And for the record, the Westfield account? We got it 6 months later. Your revised data was correct. Their previous quarter had shown artificial growth due to a one-time acquisition. The trajectory you projected was exactly what played out. Sophie blinked in surprise. What? Your analysis was right. I was just too proud and too angry in the moment to admit it. He glanced at Emma, who was now contentedly playing with a small stuffed rabbit. What's her name? Emma, Sophie replied softly. Emma Grace Bennett. She's 11 months old. Emma, Alexander repeated, a strange tenderness in his voice. Did you ever tell her about me? Sophie shook her head. She's a baby, Alexander, but I have a small photo of you I kept, for when she's older and starts asking questions. The admission cost her, revealing she hadn't completely erased him from their lives. Alexander was quiet for a moment. I would have wanted to know her, Sophie. Whatever you might think of me, I would have taken responsibility. Emma began to fuss, squirming in her carrier. Sophie unbuckled her and lifted her onto her lap, where the baby immediately started reaching for everything on the tray table. She's active, Sophie explained, moving a plastic cup out of Emma's reach. Never stops exploring. Like her mother, Alexander observed with the ghost of a smile, always questioning, investigating. The comment caught Sophie off guard, the fact that he remembered this detail about her, that he'd ever paid enough attention to know her that well. For a brief moment, the connection they'd once shared flickered between them. So what happens now? Alexander asked, watching as Sophie distracted Emma with a colourful toy from her bag. You're on the wrong flight, heading to a city where you have no plans. He hesitated. With my daughter. Sophie sighed. As soon as we land, I'll talk to customer service. Maybe they can get me on the next flight to Minneapolis without charging me for another ticket. It was their gate agent who didn't check properly. And what's in Minneapolis? My cousin Jenna. She has a spare room and knows someone hiring at a marketing firm. Nothing glamorous, just social media management for local businesses, but it's in my field and has benefits. Sophie didn't mention that she'd been laid off from her retail job 2 months ago, or that her landlord had given her notice to vacate. Pride was one of the few things she had left. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his business mind clearly working through scenarios. And if you can't get on another flight, San Francisco is expensive. Do you have somewhere to stay? Enough money to cover a hotel? The questions hit a nerve. We'll manage, Sophie replied stiffly. We always do. That's not an answer, Alexander pressed. Do you have a contingency plan? My contingency plan is to figure it out as I go, which is what I've been doing since the day I found out I was pregnant, Sophie snapped, perhaps more harshly than intended. Several nearby passengers glanced over, and she lowered her voice. Look, I'm not your problem, and I've never asked you for anything. That's not about to change because of a booking error. Alexander studied her, taking in the stubborn set of her jaw that he recognized from years ago. The protective way she held Emma, the determination in her eyes despite the clear exhaustion behind them. Finally he nodded. Fair enough, but the fact remains that you're currently on a 5-hour flight to San Francisco and you're sitting next to the father of your child, who just found out he has a daughter. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, setting it on the tray table between them. This conversation isn't over, Sophie, not by a long shot. The seatbelt sign illuminated as the plane encountered turbulence, a fitting metaphor for the upheaval in Sophie's carefully constructed life. As she secured Emma back in her carrier, Sophie wondered if boarding the wrong flight might be the smallest of the mistakes she'd made today. The turbulence subsided after several minutes, but the tension between Sophie and Alexander remained palpable. Emma had dozed off in her carrier, her tiny chest rising and falling with each peaceful breath, blissfully unaware of the emotional storm brewing around her. Sophie envied her daughter's innocence, her ability to sleep through life's complications. She has your nose, Alexander observed quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them, and your chin. But those eyes, he trailed off, still processing the reality of fatherhood that had been thrust upon him at 30,000 feet. Sophie glanced at him sideways, unsure how to navigate this unexpected territory. For years, she'd rehearsed what she might say if they ever crossed paths again, but none of those imagined scenarios involved being trapped beside him on a cross-country flight with nowhere to retreat. "Does she sleep through the night?" Alexander asked, his question surprisingly ordinary, domestic even. "Most nights now," Sophie replied, her tone softening slightly. "The first 6 months were rough. She had colic. I walked miles around my apartment building each night, bouncing her while she screamed." Alexander winced. "You did that alone?" "My neighbor Mrs. Petrovich would take her sometimes when I had an early shift. She's 74, but has the energy of someone half her age." Sophie smiled faintly at the memory of the no-nonsense Russian immigrant who had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Emma. "She cried when I told her we were moving to Minneapolis." Alexander nodded, processing this glimpse into their life. "And your parents? Do they help?" Sophie's expression hardened. "They made their position clear when I told them I was keeping the baby. My father said I'd ruined my future, thrown away my education for a workplace fling that was clearly going nowhere. He offered to pay for an abortion, and when I refused, he said I was on my own." She swallowed hard, the memory still painful despite the years. "My mother sends birthday and Christmas cards with small checks, but she won't defy my father by doing more." "I'm sorry," Alexander said, genuine regret in his voice. "That must have been difficult." "We managed," Sophie replied, the simple phrase encapsulating countless sleepless nights, tight budgets, and moments of overwhelming doubt. The flight attendant returned with their drinks. Alexander took a long sip of his scotch before setting it down deliberately. "So, Minneapolis, why there specifically? Like I said, my cousin has connections at a marketing firm, plus the cost of living is reasonable. I can afford a 2-bedroom apartment on the salary they're offering." Sophie straightened slightly, a hint of pride creeping into her voice. "I've kept my skills current, taking online courses whenever Emma was asleep. I've built a decent portfolio of freelance work." Alexander's eyebrows rose slightly. "You still want to work in marketing, even after—" "After what? After I was right about the Westfield data?" Sophie challenged. "I made a procedural mistake, Alexander. I didn't follow protocol, but my analysis was correct, which you just admitted yourself." "That's fair," he conceded, running a finger around the rim of his glass. "Have you applied to agencies in Philadelphia?" Sophie hesitated, then decided there was little point in hiding the truth. "I did, at first, but your name carries weight in the industry, and Philadelphia's marketing community is smaller than you might think. I never directly blamed you, but word gets around when an intern clashes with a rising executive. Most hiring managers weren't interested in hearing my side." Alexander's expression darkened. "I never spoke against you to anyone in the industry." "You didn't have to," Sophie replied without accusation, simply stating a fact. "People connect dots, make assumptions. A recommendation from my internship would have helped, but after resigning abruptly—" She shrugged. "Water under the bridge now." A flight attendant passed by, distributing small packets of pretzels. Sophie accepted one and carefully opened it, trying not to wake Emma. The mundane action gave her a moment to compose herself. "What about you?" she finally asked, glancing at Alexander's perfectly tailored suit, the subtle but unmistakable Rolex on his wrist. "CEO of Vertex now, I see. Congratulations. That's quite an achievement for someone your age." Alexander's lip curved in a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Chief Executive Officer as of 18 months ago. The board voted unanimously after I orchestrated the merger with Next-Tech Solutions." "I read about that," Sophie admitted. "It was a smart move. Their hardware, your software platforms, vertical integration at its finest." Alexander looked surprised that she'd kept tabs on his company. The market agreed. Our stock doubled within 3 months. An awkward silence fell between them, the corporate success story highlighting the vastly different trajectories their lives had taken since their paths diverged 5 years ago. Emma stirred in her sleep, making the small snuffling sound that usually preceded waking. Sophie automatically reached for the diaper bag under the seat in front of her. "I should probably change her before she fully wakes up," Sophie said, gathering the necessary supplies. "Excuse me." Alexander stood immediately to let her pass. As Sophie made her way to the tiny airplane lavatory, she felt his eyes following her, likely taking in her worn sneakers and the small hole near the hem of her jeans that she hadn't had time to mend. The contrast between her appearance and his polished exterior couldn't have been more stark. In the cramped confines of the bathroom, Sophie deftly changed Emma's diaper, a skill perfected through thousands of repetitions. As she worked, she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror, the dark circles under her eyes, the tension lines around her mouth that hadn't been there 5 years ago. "What are we going to do, Em?" she whispered to her drowsy daughter. "Your dad is sitting right out there, and he doesn't seem like the type to just say goodbye when we land." Emma's only response was to grab at Sophie's necklace, a simple silver pendant that had been a gift from Mrs. Petrovich on Emma's first birthday. When Sophie returned to her seat, Alexander was on his phone, his voice low but authoritative. "Need you to contact the Minneapolis office and postpone tomorrow's meetings. Something's come up." He noticed Sophie standing in the aisle and quickly ended the call. "We'll discuss the details later." Sophie settled Emma back into her carrier, where the baby immediately became fascinated with the window shade, pulling it up and down with delighted giggles. "You didn't have to do that," Sophie said, nodding toward Alexander's phone. "Change. Your plans, I mean?" "Actually, I did," he replied with surprising firmness. "I just discovered I have a daughter, Sophie. Everything else can wait." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. "Alexander, I don't expect anything from you. We've managed this long on our own." "That's the 3rd time you've said we've managed." "As if it's supposed to end the conversation," Alexander observed, frustration edging into his voice. "But here's what I'm hearing. You've been struggling as a single mother while building a career from scratch, with minimal family support, because my assistant buried your letter, and I was too caught up in my corporate climb to follow up when you disappeared." Put so bluntly, Sophie had no ready response. "I've missed 11 months of Emma's life," Alexander continued, his voice dropping to ensure nearby passengers couldn't hear. "I never saw her first smile, never heard her first laugh. I didn't hold her when she was colicky or take a turn walking her at night when you were exhausted." His hands clenched into fists on the armrests. "I can't get that time back. But I'm not missing another day." The quiet intensity of his declaration sent a chill down Sophie's spine. She'd expected anger, perhaps denial, maybe even indifference, but not this immediate, unwavering commitment. "What exactly are you saying?" she asked cautiously. Alexander's hazel eyes, so like Emma's, met hers with determination. "I'm saying that when this plane lands in San Francisco, we're going to figure this out, together, whether that fits with your Minneapolis plans or not." The plane began its initial descent into San Francisco, the captain's voice crackling over the intercom about local weather conditions and the expected arrival time. Sophie stared out the window at the approaching cityscape, the iconic Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance through scattered clouds. The beauty of the view contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside her. Alexander's declaration hung between them like an invisible barrier. His determination to be part of Emma's life, their lives, upended the careful plans Sophie had constructed. Minneapolis represented stability, affordability, a fresh start. San Francisco was expensive, unknown, and now complicated by Alexander's presence. "You can't just decide you're part of our lives now," Sophie finally said, keeping her voice low, as Emma played with a small plastic cup the flight attendant had given her. "It doesn't work that way." Alexander turned to face her, his expression serious. "I understand that, but you can't expect me to walk away now that I know about her." "That's exactly what you did 5 years ago," Sophie countered. "I didn't know." "About her then," he replied evenly. "That changes everything." Sophie scoffed quietly. "And what about your life now, your company? The board won't care that you suddenly discovered you have a child with a former intern?" A flash of something, concern perhaps, crossed Alexander's features before he composed himself. "My personal life is my business. Vertex has paternity leave policies like any modern company." "Paternity leave," Sophie repeated, testing the phrase. "So you imagine yourself changing diapers and warming bottles between conference calls?" "If necessary, yes." His firm response surprised her. "I've missed nearly a year of her life already. I won't miss more because of work." The flight attendant interrupted their tense exchange, asking them to return their seats to the upright position for landing. Sophie busied herself securing Emma's carrier and checking that the diaper bag was properly stowed, grateful for the momentary distraction. As the plane dipped lower, Emma's eyes widened at the pressure change. Her little face scrunched up in discomfort before she let out a wail that turned heads throughout the cabin. "Her ears," Sophie explained, quickly rummaging in her bag for a pacifier. "The pressure bothers her." Alexander watched helplessly as Sophie tried to comfort the screaming infant. "What can I do?" he asked, genuine concern in his voice. "Nothing, it's fine," Sophie insisted, though Emma's cries intensified as the plane continued its descent. An elderly woman across the aisle leaned over. "Try nursing her or giving her a bottle, dear. The swallowing helps equalize the pressure." Sophie nodded gratefully, already pulling a prepared bottle from her bag. Emma initially resisted, turning her head away as her cries grew more frantic. "Here, let me help," Alexander offered, reaching for the bottle. "You hold her. I'll try to get her to take it." Too concerned about Emma's distress to argue, Sophie nodded. Alexander carefully held the bottle while Sophie cradled Emma, gently coaxing her to accept the nipple. After a few more tearful protests, Emma began to drink, her cries subsiding as she swallowed. "There we go," Alexander murmured, his voice taking on a softness Sophie had never heard before. "That's better, isn't it?" The moment of teamwork created an unexpected intimacy between them. For a brief instant, they weren't former lovers with a complicated history. They were simply two people focused on comforting a child they both cared about. When Emma had calmed, Alexander reluctantly withdrew his hand from the bottle, leaving Sophie to continue feeding her. "You're good at this," he observed quietly, "being a mother." The simple compliment caught Sophie off guard. After years of questioning her decisions, of working relentlessly to provide for Emma while doubting she was doing enough, hearing him, acknowledge her efforts meant more than she wanted to admit. "I had to be," she replied, her voice softer than intended. The plane touched down with a slight bump, taxiing toward the terminal as passengers around them began gathering belongings and switching on phones. The reality of their situation came rushing back. Sophie and Emma were in the wrong city with limited funds, and Alexander was proposing to insert himself into their lives after 5 years of absence. "I have a suite at the Fairmont," Alexander said as they waited for deplaning to begin. "There's plenty of room for you and Emma while we sort things out." Sophie's pride bristled. "We're not staying with you, Alexander." "Where will you go then?" he challenged. "You said yourself you don't have a plan for San Francisco. You don't know anyone here. Hotels in this city cost more per night than you probably spend on rent in a week." The harsh truth of his assessment stung, but Sophie maintained her composure. "I'll figure something out. I always do. Alexander pinched the bridge of his nose, visibly trying to contain his frustration. This isn't about you and me, Sophie. It's about Emma. She needs a safe, comfortable place to stay while you deal with the airline. The Fairmont suite has 2 bedrooms. You'll have your privacy. Before Sophie could respond, her phone chimed with a message. She glanced down to see a text from her cousin Jenna. Did you make your connection? Let me know when you land in Minneapolis. Can't wait to see you and Emma tomorrow. Reality crashed down on Sophie. Jenna was expecting them. The job interview was scheduled for the day after tomorrow. Everything she owned, the few possessions she hadn't sold to afford the move, was being shipped to Minneapolis. I need to call the airline immediately, Sophie muttered, more to herself than to Alexander. Find out when the next flight to Minneapolis leaves. See if they'll honor my ticket. Alexander watched her, his expression unreadable. And if they can't get you on a flight until tomorrow, or if they want to charge you for a new ticket you can't afford, Sophie had no answer. The weight of her precarious situation settled on her shoulders as passengers began to stand and retrieve luggage from overhead compartments. Let me help you, Sophie, Alexander said, his voice dropping to ensure only she could hear. Not because I feel obligated, but because I want to, for Emma's sake, if not for yours. The mention of Emma's welfare was calculated, and they both knew it. Sophie could refuse help for herself, but denying what was best for her daughter was another matter entirely. One night, Sophie finally conceded, exhaustion evident in her voice. We'll stay tonight while I sort out the flight situation. That's it. Alexander nodded, clearly relieved she'd accepted even this small compromise. Thank you. As they gathered their belongings and prepared to deplane, Sophie felt a sense of foreboding. One wrong turn at the airport had cascaded into a reunion she'd never anticipated, with a man whose absence had shaped the last 5 years of her life. Now he was offering shelter, assistance, and a determination to be part of their future. Emma babbled happily in her carrier, reaching for Alexander's tie as he leaned over to help collect Sophie's scattered items. The simple gesture, a daughter, innocently reaching for her father, crystallized the complexity of what lay ahead. Whatever Sophie had planned for their fresh start, the universe clearly had other ideas. Stepping into the aisle, she steeled herself for what awaited in San Francisco. One night, she reminded herself firmly, just one night to regroup before continuing to Minneapolis. What could possibly change in a single evening? The Fairmont Hotel stood majestically atop Nob Hill, its grand architecture overlooking the San Francisco Bay with an air of timeless elegance. As Alexander's private car pulled under the ornate entrance portico, Sophie clutched Emma tighter, suddenly acutely aware of her worn jeans and simple t-shirt. The contrast between her appearance and the hotel's opulence made her stomach tighten. With discomfort, "Mr. Reid, welcome back," the doorman greeted, opening the car door with a practiced flourish. His eyes briefly registered surprise at the sight of Sophie and Emma, but his professional demeanor never wavered. Alexander emerged first, immediately turning to help Sophie with the diaper bag while she managed Emma. The ease with which he stepped into an assistive role unnerved her. It felt too natural, too much like the partnership they might have had under different circumstances. "Thank you, James," Alexander replied to the doorman. "Could you please have the kitchen send up a selection of menu items suitable for an infant around 11 months old?" "Of course, sir. Right away." The lobby's grandeur nearly took Sophie's breath away. Marble columns, ornate ceilings, and crystal chandeliers that spoke of a world she'd never inhabited. Several well-dressed guests glanced curiously at their unusual trio as they crossed toward the private elevator bank. "The presidential suite has its own entrance," Alexander explained quietly, guiding them away from the main reception desk. Sophie adjusted Emma on her hip, conscious of her daughter's widening eyes at the new surroundings. "This is excessive," she whispered. It's convenient, he countered as they entered the elevator. Private, spacious, and with room service available for anything Emma might need. The elevator opened directly into the suite, revealing a stunning space that made Sophie freeze in the doorway. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased panoramic views of the city and bay beyond. Plush furnishings, in muted creams and blues, complemented the warm wood and marble surfaces. Fresh flowers adorned various tables, their subtle fragrance perfuming. The air. You live like this all the time. Sophie couldn't keep the disbelief from her voice as she stepped hesitantly into the living area. Alexander set down the diaper bag on an armchair. I travel frequently for work. Hotels are simpler than maintaining multiple residences. Right. Simpler, Sophie echoed, thinking of the tiny Philadelphia apartment she'd struggled to afford each month. Emma squirmed in Sophie's arms, eager to explore this new environment. Sophie reluctantly set her down on the plush carpet, watching as her daughter immediately crawled toward a decorative vase on a low table. "Let me show you to your room," Alexander said, moving the vase out of Emma's reach in one smooth motion. "There's a connecting suite through here that should work well for the two of you." He led them through double doors into a spacious bedroom, with its own sitting area and ensuite bathroom. A king-sized bed dominated the space, draped in luxurious linens that probably cost more than Sophie's entire bedroom set back home. "The bathroom has a tub if Emma needs a bath," Alexander pointed out, "and there's a separate shower. The closet has extra robes and toiletries." Sophie set the diaper bag on a luggage rack, trying to process the surreal nature of their situation. 24 hours ago, she'd been in her half-packed apartment, nervous about the move to Minneapolis. Now she was standing in a presidential suite with the father of her child, a man who until this morning had been nothing more than a painful memory. "I should call the airline," Sophie said, pulling out her phone. "Find out about flights to Minneapolis." Alexander nodded. "I'll give you privacy. I need to make some calls myself." He hesitated at the door. "Will Emma be all right while you're on the phone?" Sophie glanced at her daughter, who was now contentedly exploring the bedroom carpet's thick pile. "She'll be fine here with me." Left alone, Sophie sank onto the edge of the bed and dialed the airline's customer service number. After navigating the automated system and waiting on hold for nearly 15 minutes, she finally reached a representative. The conversation went exactly as she'd feared. Yes, she had boarded the wrong flight. No, it wasn't entirely the airline's fault. She should have verified her boarding pass. The best they could offer was a standby position on tomorrow morning's flight to Minneapolis, with no guarantee she'd get a seat. A confirmed seat would cost an additional $435, which might as well have been $4,350 for all Sophie could afford it. By the time she ended the call, her head was pounding. Emma had grown fussy, overtired from the long day of travel and unfamiliar surroundings. Sophie lifted her daughter, gently bouncing her while trying to think through her limited options. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Sophie, there's food here if you're hungry, and some things for Emma." She opened the door to find Alexander standing beside a room service cart laden with covered dishes. The domestic normality of the scene, a father bringing food for his child, created an ache in Sophie's chest for what might have been. "Thank you," she managed, stepping aside to let him wheel the cart into the room. "How did it go with the airline?" Alexander asked, lifting silver covers to reveal an assortment of finger foods appropriate for Emma. Soft fruits, tiny sandwiches cut into shapes, and what appeared to be homemade applesauce. Sophie sighed, setting Emma in the center of the bed, surrounded by pillows to prevent her from rolling off. "They can put me on standby for tomorrow morning, but there's no guarantee we'll get seats. A confirmed booking costs more than I can manage right now." Alexander nodded, processing this information while arranging a small plate of food for Emma. What about your job interview? Can it be rescheduled? I left a message for Jenna to call me. I haven't heard back yet. Sophie accepted the plate he offered, surprised by his thoughtfulness in selecting appropriate foods for Emma. How did you know what to order for her? A faint smile crossed his face. I asked the chef to consult with his sister, who has a 1-year-old. He was very thorough in his recommendations. The simple explanation revealed an adaptability Sophie hadn't expected. When faced with an unfamiliar situation, Alexander had immediately found a solution, leveraging resources at his disposal to meet Emma's needs. "There's food for you too," he added, gesturing to the covered plates still on the cart. "I wasn't sure what you'd want, so I ordered a selection." Sophie helped Emma with a piece of banana, buying time before responding to his underlying concern about the Minneapolis plans. "The interview is important, but I can probably reschedule for later this week if I explain the situation." "And if you can't get on tomorrow's flight?" The question hung between them, laden with implications neither was ready to address. Sophie focused on Emma, who was happily mashing a strawberry between her fingers. "I'll figure it out," she said automatically, her standard response to life's challenges over the past 5 years. Alexander took a seat in the armchair near the window, maintaining a respectful distance while clearly not intending to leave. "Sophie, I know you don't want to hear this, but I have a proposal." She tensed, anticipating what was coming. "Alexander, just hear me out," he interrupted gently. "Vertex has a major office in San Francisco, our headquarters in fact. The marketing department is always looking for talented people, especially those with digital experience." Sophie stared at him, disbelieving. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm suggesting a possibility," he clarified, "one that would allow you to work in your field, earn a competitive salary and—" he hesitated, choosing his words carefully, "give us time to figure out how to co-parent Emma." The proposal was simultaneously tempting and terrifying. A job in her actual field, not the retail positions she'd been forced to take, financial stability. And Emma would have her father in her life, something Sophie had always wanted for her daughter, despite her complicated feelings toward Alexander. "You can't just snap your fingers and create a position for me," Sophie protested, though with less conviction than she intended. "And I won't accept charity or nepotism." Alexander's expression hardened slightly. "I wouldn't offer if you weren't qualified. Your analysis of the Westfield data proved your abilities. This wouldn't be charity, Sophie. It would be righting a wrong that kept you from pursuing the career you deserved." Emma let out a happy squeal, oblivious to the tension between her parents, as she discovered the joy of squishing applesauce between her fingers. "And what about us?" Sophie asked quietly, using a napkin to clean Emma's hands. "What exactly are you proposing there?" Alexander's gaze was steady, unflinching. "I'm proposing that we start with being Emma's parents. Whatever was between us 5 years ago, whatever feelings might still exist, those are secondary to her needs. I want the chance to be her father, Sophie, a real father, not just a name on a birth certificate or a monthly check." The sincerity in his voice weakened Sophie's defenses. For 5 years, she'd constructed a narrative of Alexander as callous, selfish, prioritizing his career over everything. The man sitting across from her now, concerned about infant-appropriate foods and speaking of parental responsibility, didn't fit that mold. "I need time to think," she finally said. "This is all happening so fast." Alexander nodded, rising from the chair. "Of course. Take all the time you need tonight. But tomorrow, decisions will have to be made. About Minneapolis, about Emma, about our future, whatever shape that takes." As he moved toward the door, Emma called out, "Bah!" and reached toward him with sticky fingers. The simple gesture, her daughter reaching for her father, crystallized the weight of the choice before Sophie. "Alexander," she called as he reached the doorway. He turned, expectant. "Thank you for the food, for understanding." He offered a gentle smile. "Get some rest. We'll talk in the morning." As the door closed behind him, Sophie looked around the luxurious room, then at Emma, happily exploring her new surroundings. One wrong flight had completely derailed her carefully constructed plans, opening a door she'd long believed permanently closed. The question now was whether she had the courage to walk through it. The digital clock on the nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m. in soft blue light. Sophie stood by the floor-to-ceiling, windows of the bedroom, cradling a finally sleeping Emma against her shoulder. The San Francisco skyline twinkled before her, a constellation of lights against the dark canvas of night, beautiful and unfamiliar. Much like the possibilities Alexander had presented hours earlier. Emma sighed in her sleep, her tiny body, completely relaxed in the security of her mother's arms. Sophie pressed a gentle kiss to her daughter's forehead, inhaling the sweet baby scent that still lingered despite the day's travels. For nearly a year, it had been just the two of them, against the world. Every decision Sophie made, every sacrifice, every late night and early morning had been for this perfect little being who had her heart completely. Was she really considering staying in San Francisco? Taking a job that, despite Alexander's assurances, felt uncomfortably like charity, allowing Emma to form attachments to a father who might decide corporate life was more important after all. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Sophie carefully placed Emma in the center of the king-sized bed, surrounding her with pillows before opening the door a crack. Alexander stood in the hallway, his tie gone, shirt sleeves rolled up, looking more human than the polished CEO who had escorted them to the hotel. He held 2 steaming mugs. "I heard movement," he explained quietly. "Thought you might need this." He offered one of the mugs, hot chocolate, not coffee, with tiny marshmallows floating on top. The thoughtful gesture caught Sophie off guard. "How did you know I don't drink coffee at night?" A shadow of the old familiarity passed between them. "You told me once it gives you nightmares. Some things I didn't forget." Sophie accepted the mug, allowing the door to open wider. Emma just fell asleep. She was unsettled in the new environment. Alexander nodded, glancing past her to the bed where Emma lay. "May I come in? Just to talk. I promise I'll keep my voice down." Against her better judgment, Sophie stepped aside. Alexander entered, maintaining a respectful distance as he took a seat in the armchair while Sophie perched on the edge of the bed beside Emma. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted, staring into his mug. "Kept thinking about everything I've missed. Her birth, first smile, first word." His voice remained steady, but Sophie caught the slight tremor in his hands around the mug. What was her first word? The simple question carried the weight of 1,000 missed moments. Sophie's throat tightened. "Mama," she replied softly, but ball was a close second. "She loves anything she can throw." Alexander smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his features from the serious businessman to something warmer, more accessible. "Athletic, that comes from your side. I was terrible at sports." She started walking at 10 months, Sophie continued, surprising herself with the desire to share these milestones. "Early, according to the pediatrician. She's fearless, falls down, gets right back up." "Like her mother," Alexander observed quietly. The comment hung between them, acknowledging the strength Sophie had shown, raising Emma alone, rebuilding her life piece by piece after everything collapsed. "I called my cousin Jenna," Sophie said, changing the subject. "Explained the situation. She's disappointed but understands. The job interview can be rescheduled for next week if needed." Alexander nodded, taking a sip of his hot chocolate before asking the question that clearly weighed on him. "And have you decided about my proposal?" Sophie ran a finger around the rim of her mug. "I've been thinking about it all night. Part of me says it's crazy, uprooting our plans based on one conversation with someone who wasn't in our lives yesterday. And the other part?" Alexander prompted when she fell silent. The other part wonders if Emma deserves the chance to know. Her father, if maybe this wrong flight wasn't so wrong after all. Sophie met his gaze directly. But I need to know something first. If I stay, if I consider the job, what happens when the novelty wears off? When board meetings run late and Emma has tantrums and the reality of parenting isn't as appealing as the idea of it? Alexander set his mug down, his expression solemn. I can't predict the future, Sophie. I can't promise I'll never disappoint either of you, but I can promise that I won't walk away, not again. Whether you take the job or not, whether you stay in San Francisco or go to Minneapolis, I will be Emma's father. I'll commute if I have to. I'll video call every night. I'll do whatever it takes. His determination was palpable, reminiscent of the driven young executive Sophie had fallen for years ago. But now that drive was focused on something more meaningful than corporate success. 1 month, Sophie said finally. I'll stay 1 month. Take temporary housing. Talk to your HR department about the position. We'll introduce you to Emma gradually, see how she responds. She took a deep breath. But I'm not making any promises beyond that, and I'll need my own place. Not a hotel, not your place. Somewhere Emma and I can have our own space. Relief washed over Alexander's features. Agreed, all of it. I know someone in real estate who can find you a suitable apartment immediately. And HR will set up an interview without mentioning any connection to me. Emma stirred slightly, making the tiny snuffling sound that usually preceded waking. Both adults froze, watching as she settled back into sleep. I should go, Alexander whispered, rising carefully to avoid creating noise. At the door, he paused. Thank you, Sophie, for considering this, for giving me a chance I'm not sure I deserve. As the door closed behind him, Sophie turned back to the window, city lights, blurring slightly as unexpected tears filled her eyes. 1 month to determine if a family cobbled together from past mistakes and chance encounters could possibly work. 1 month to decide if she was brave enough to trust again. 3 weeks into their San Francisco experiment, Sophie sat in a sleek conference room on the 23rd floor of the Vertex Innovations headquarters, reviewing marketing analytics for their newest software platform. Sunlight streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the digital presentation she'd created for tomorrow's client meeting. The job had materialized exactly as Alexander promised. A legitimate position that matched her skills and experience, with no special treatment beyond the initial introduction to HR. Her phone vibrated with a text message. Emma loves the swings. At Dolores Park, heading home in 20. A small smile tugged at Sophie's lips as she typed a quick response. Be there soon. Save me some of that ice cream I know you bought her. The casual domesticity of their communication still felt surreal. Alexander had been true to his word, integrating himself into Emma's life with patience and genuine effort. They'd established a rhythm. Sophie worked while Alexander adjusted his schedule to spend mornings with Emma, then they traded in the afternoons. When Sophie returned to the temporary apartment, Alexander's real estate contact had secured for them in Hayes Valley. The arrangement wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, miscommunications, and the occasional clash of parenting philosophies. But watching Emma light up when Alexander entered the room, hearing her experimental attempts at saying "da-da," made the challenges worthwhile. Sophie gathered her materials and headed toward the elevator. As she waited, Cassandra Martinez, the marketing director who had hired her, stopped beside her. Heading out already? It's only 4:30, Cassandra remarked, though her tone remained friendly. Emma's waiting, Sophie explained simply. Cassandra nodded with understanding. The presentation looks excellent, by the way. The team is impressed with how quickly you've grasped our product ecosystem. Thank you. I'm enjoying the challenge." The elevator arrived, and both women stepped inside. As the doors closed, Cassandra's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Can I offer some unsolicited advice?" she asked, pressing the button for the lobby. Sophie tensed but nodded. She'd encountered enough workplace advice as a single mother to be wary. "You don't need to prove yourself by working late or coming in early," Cassandra said. "This company values results, not face time. Take advantage of the flexible schedule." "I do." "You have children?" Sophie asked, surprised. "2 boys, 7 and 9. My wife handles mornings, I handle afternoons. We make it work," Cassandra smiled. "The point is, good talent is too valuable to lose over outdated expectations about working hours. Remember that." The unexpected support caught Sophie off guard. In Philadelphia, her retail managers had been far less accommodating about her childcare constraints. "I appreciate that, truly." They parted ways in the lobby, Cassandra heading to a meeting, Sophie stepping out into the San Francisco afternoon. The walk to her apartment took 15 minutes, a luxury compared to her hour-long commute. In Philadelphia, another unexpected benefit of this new arrangement. When Sophie arrived home, she found Alexander sitting on the living room floor with Emma, surrounded by building blocks. Her daughter squealed with delight at her entrance, crawling rapidly toward her with arms outstretched. "Mama!" Emma proclaimed as Sophie scooped her up, covering her chubby cheeks with kisses. "She's been saying that non-stop," Alexander reported, rising from the floor with a slight grimace. "I think I've officially been demoted to second place." "She's a mama's girl," Sophie agreed, though she added gently, "but she wouldn't stop watching the door once you left this morning. Kept saying da and pointing." The information visibly pleased him. "We had a good day, the park, lunch at that organic place you mentioned, and only one minor meltdown when another child tried to claim her swing." "Sounds like progress," Sophie observed, setting Emma down to explore. "Last week there were 3 meltdowns, as I recall." Alexander moved to the kitchen, retrieving a pint of ice cream from the freezer. "I saved you some, as requested. Though I maintain that ice cream before dinner breaks at least 5 parenting rules," says the man who bought her a stuffed animal at every store on Union Square last weekend, Sophie countered, accepting the small bowl he offered. Their banter had evolved into something comfortable over the weeks, the sharp edges of past hurts gradually softening. They weren't friends exactly, but they were building something functional for Emma's sake. Alexander leaned against the counter, watching Emma determinedly stack blocks, only to knock them down with gleeful shouts. "I got a call from the London office today," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "They need me there next week for the European product launch." Sophie paused mid-bite, an uncomfortable echo of the past reverberating between them. Alexander leaving for London. It felt too familiar, too painful. "I see," she managed, setting down her bowl. "How long will you be gone?" "That depends," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I'd like to take you and Emma with me." The suggestion hung in the air, unexpected and weighty with implications. "To London? Alexander, we can't just—" "Why not?" he interrupted gently. "Your position is remote capable. Emma doesn't have daycare commitments yet. It would be for 2 weeks, 3 at most." Sophie shook her head, instinctively resistant. "Emma's routine is important, and we're still figuring out this co-parenting arrangement here, let alone internationally." Alexander moved closer, his expression earnest. "Sophie, I promised I wouldn't disappear from Emma's life again, but my job sometimes requires travel. We need to figure out how to make that work without disrupting her relationship with either of us." The logic was sound, but Sophie's hesitation stemmed from something deeper. Their arrangement still felt temporary, provisional, a trial that could end with her returning to plan Minneapolis if things didn't work out. Going to London together seemed like a step towards something more permanent. "I'll think about it," she finally said, returning her attention to Emma, who had abandoned her blocks in favor of attempting to climb the coffee table. Later that night, after Emma was asleep, Sophie stood on the small balcony of the apartment considering Alexander's proposal. The past 3 weeks had been surprisingly functional. More than that, they'd been good. Emma was thriving with 2 engaged parents. Sophie's career was back on track, and Alexander had proven himself committed and reliable, adjusting his executive schedule around diaper changes and nap times without complaint. If she was honest with herself, the 1-month trial period had been a protective measure, a way to maintain emotional distance while testing Alexander's commitment. With only 1 week remaining, she faced a decision she'd been avoiding: continue building this unconventional family in San Francisco, or stick to her original plan of independence in Minneapolis. The balcony door slid open behind her. Alexander joined her, offering a glass of wine as a peace offering. "Penny, for your thoughts?" Sophie accepted the glass, gathering her courage. "If we go to London," she said slowly, "what does that mean for us, for this arrangement?" Alexander considered the question carefully. "It means we're committed to making this work for Emma's sake. Beyond that—" He hesitated. "I think that's something we're still figuring out day by day." His honesty was refreshing. No pressure, no expectations beyond their shared priority of Emma's well-being. Perhaps that was enough for now. "Okay," Sophie decided, taking a sip of wine. "We'll go to London, but Emma gets her own passport stamp." London greeted them with uncharacteristic sunshine and mild temperatures, a welcome change from San Francisco's summer fog. Alexander had arranged a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in Kensington, elegant yet practical with child-proofed corners, and a small nursery already equipped with a crib and toys. The thoughtfulness of these preparations wasn't lost on Sophie. "The meeting at European headquarters starts at 9, Alexander explained as they settled in after the long flight. Emma, remarkably resilient despite the time change, explored the new space with enthusiastic crawling. "I should be done by 3. Will you 2 be all right until then?" Sophie nodded, unpacking Emma's favorite stuffed rabbit. "We'll get oriented. Maybe visit a park if she's not too jet-lagged. Don't worry about us." As Alexander prepared to leave the next morning, dressed in one of his impeccable suits, Emma reached for him from Sophie's arms. "Dada," she said clearly, her little hands opening and closing in the universal pick-me-up gesture. The simple word transformed Alexander's expression. He took Emma, business meeting momentarily forgotten, as he held his daughter close. "I'll see you this afternoon, sweetheart," he promised, pressing a kiss to her forehead before reluctantly handing her back to Sophie. The domesticity of the moment struck Sophie forcefully. This was what they might have had all along if circumstances had been different, if Alexander had received her letter, if she'd tried harder to reach him, if either of them had been less proud and more persistent. "Sophie," Alexander said, pausing at the door, "there's a flower shop on the corner of Gloucester Road. The owner there might interest you." With that cryptic remark, he was gone. Curiosity piqued, Sophie bundled Emma into her stroller after breakfast and set out to explore their temporary neighborhood. The flower shop was exactly where Alexander had indicated, a charming storefront with buckets of fresh blooms displayed beneath a green awning reading "Tessa's Botanical." Inside, Sophie found herself surrounded by the familiar, comforting scent of fresh flowers. Emma cooed in delight at the colors and textures as Sophie browsed, wondering why Alexander had specifically mentioned this place. "Can I help you find something?" asked an older woman emerging from the back room. Her British accent was softened by years of wear, and silver streaked her auburn hair. "Just looking," Sophie replied. "We're visiting from the States." The woman smiled at Emma. "What a beautiful child. Those eyes remind me of someone." She extended a weathered hand. "I'm Tessa, the owner. Sophie, and this is Emma." Recognition flickered in Tessa's eyes. Sophie and Emma. You wouldn't happen to know Alexander Reid, would you?" Sophie's surprise must have shown on her face because Tessa chuckled knowingly. "He called this morning. Said I might have a visitor." Tessa gestured around the shop. "He mentioned you owned a flower shop back home." "It was small, nothing like this," Sophie admitted, taking in the elegant arrangements and high-end inventory. "But yes, flowers have always been special to me." Tessa nodded thoughtfully. "Alexander used to come in here years ago, during his London assignment. Always bought white daisies. Said they reminded him of someone special he'd left behind. That the revelation landed like a physical weight on Sophie's chest. White daisies had been her favorite at the shop where she'd worked during her internship. Alexander had teased her about such a simple preference when she was surrounded by exotic blooms all day. "He never forgot you, dear," Tessa continued gently. "Kept a photo in his wallet. Young man carrying that kind of regret. It was plain to see whenever he spoke of America." Emma began to fuss, providing Sophie a moment to compose herself. As she attended to her daughter, the implications of Tessa's words sank in. While Sophie had been building a life with Emma, believing Alexander had carelessly forgotten her, he had been carrying his own form of regret across the ocean. "He asked if I might show you some of our operations," Tessa offered. "Said you might enjoy seeing how a London flower shop differs from American ones. But perhaps another day, when the little one is settled." Sophie nodded, simultaneously touched by Alexander's thoughtfulness and overwhelmed by this new perspective on their shared past. "I'd like that very much." That evening, after Emma was asleep in the nursery, Sophie found Alexander on the apartment's small balcony, gazing out at the London skyline, illuminated against the darkening sky. "You went to the flower shop," he said, a statement rather than a question. "I did." Sophie moved to stand beside him, close but not touching. "Tessa said you bought white daisies." Alexander nodded, his profile outlined in the city lights. Some habits are hard to break. The simplicity of his admission broke something open inside Sophie. The carefully maintained barrier she'd constructed around her heart over 5 years of solo parenting and self-protection. "Why didn't you tell me you looked for me too?" she asked quietly. "These past weeks, you've let me believe you simply accepted my disappearance." Alexander turned to face her. "Would it have mattered? When you found out you were pregnant, I wasn't there. When Emma was born, I wasn't there. My regrets don't change those facts." "They might have changed how I felt about them," Sophie admitted. "About you." The confession hung between them, opening a door neither had been brave enough to approach. "Until now." "And how do you feel now?" Alexander asked, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Sophie considered the question, thinking of their time in San Francisco, the care he'd shown Emma, the career opportunity he'd facilitated without, taking credit, the patience he'd demonstrated at every turn. "I feel like we've been given a second chance that neither of us expected or deserved," she finally said, "and I'm terrified of wasting it again." Alexander reached across the space between them, his fingers gently intertwining with hers. Unlike 5 years ago, when passion had driven their connection, this touch was tentative, weighted with history and hope. "London was where I lost you," he said softly. "Perhaps it can also be where we find our way back." As the London night enveloped them, Emma's peaceful breathing audible through the nursery monitor, Sophie allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one she'd planned. Not the independent, fresh start in Minneapolis, but something more complex, more challenging, and potentially more fulfilling. A family pieced together from wrong, turns, missed connections, and the resilience to try again. 6 months later, a light December snow dusted the San Francisco hills, a rare meteorological event that had weather stations buzzing and children running into the streets with outstretched tongues. Sophie stood at the window of their Hayes Valley home, a Victorian townhouse they'd purchased together 3 months after returning from London, watching Emma toddle excitedly through the tiny accumulation in their front garden. "She's going to be disappointed when it melts in 20 minutes, Alexander observed, coming to stand beside Sophie. He wrapped an arm around her waist, a casual intimacy that had become natural over time. "Then we'll have to take her to see real snow in Tahoe for Christmas," Sophie replied, leaning into his embrace. "First snow should be memorable." Alexander kissed the top of her head, inhaling the scent of her shampoo. "I'll make the arrangements." So much had changed since that accidental flight. The temporary marketing position had evolved into a directorship, as Sophie's insights revolutionized Vertex's approach to consumer engagement. Alexander had restructured his executive schedule to accommodate family dinners and weekend outings, demonstrating that his commitment to fatherhood was more than fleeting enthusiasm. Their relationship had progressed with careful deliberation, neither rushing into romantic reconnection nor denying the spark that remained beneath years of misunderstanding and separation. They dated properly this time, arranging childcare for evening outings where they rediscovered each other as the people they'd become, not just the younger versions who had fallen so quickly before. Outside, Emma stumbled and fell into the light. "Snow dusting!" Instead of crying, she giggled and attempted to make a snow angel, though the meager accumulation barely allowed for an imprint. "She gets that resilience from you," Alexander said, his voice tinged with admiration. "Falls down, laughs, tries again." Sophie smiled, remembering how Alexander had used those exact words to describe her strength months ago in that hotel room, when their future together seemed impossible. "She gets her determination from both of us. That stubbornness when she wants something, pure re-genetics." A timer chimed from the kitchen, summoning Sophie to check the cookies baking for Emma's playdate later that afternoon. As she moved away, Alexander caught her hand, holding her back for a moment. "Wait," he said, reaching into his pocket. "I've been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment." Sophie's heart quickened as he produced a small velvet box. Not the typical jewelry box for a ring, but something slightly larger. Alexander opened it to reveal a delicate silver compass, its face etched with intricate detail. "It's beautiful," Sophie said, confused but touched by the unexpected. "Gift. It's a symbol," Alexander explained, removing the compass and placing it in her palm. "When I first designed engagement rings for Vertex's wearable tech line, I learned that traditional sailors would give compasses to their partners, a promise to always find their way back home, no matter how far they traveled." He turned the compass over, revealing an inscription on the back. "Sometimes the wrong flight leads to the right destination." "Alexander," Sophie began, emotion tightening her throat. He took her free hand, his expression earnest. "I'm not proposing. Not yet. That will come when we're both ready. But I wanted you to have this as a promise. No matter what storms come, what wrong turns we take, what miscommunications arise, I will always find my way back to you and Emma. You're my true north, Sophie." The sentiment, heartfelt without being presumptuous, acknowledging their complicated past while committing to their future, embodied everything their relationship had become: honest, patient, and rooted in mutual respect. Emma chose that moment to bang on the window, her cheeks rosy from the cold, demanding attention from her absorbed parents. They both laughed, the spell broken, but the moment preserved. "We should probably rescue her before she freezes," Sophie said, carefully placing the compass around her neck. Its weight felt right against her skin, substantial but not heavy, much like the commitment it represented. Later that evening, after Emma was tucked into bed with dreams of snow angels dancing in her head, Sophie and Alexander sat on their porch swing, bundled against the unusual chill. Lights from neighboring houses created a warm glow against the darkening sky, and the last traces of snow melted on the sidewalks. "I received an interesting offer today," Sophie said, breaking their comfortable silence. "Vertex wants to launch a community outreach program, free marketing workshops for small business owners who can't afford professional services. They've asked me to develop and lead it." Alexander smiled, pride evident in his expression. "That's perfect for you, combining your corporate experience with your passion for helping small businesses like your flower shop." "I was thinking," Sophie continued, fingering the compass at her throat, "one of the first workshops could be for florists, teaching them digital marketing, social media strategies, how to compete with bigger operations." "Full circle," Alexander observed. "From a flower shop internship to teaching flower shop owners." Sophie nodded, watching her breath form small clouds in the cold air. "Life rarely takes us where we expect, does it? If I hadn't gotten on that wrong flight, I like to think we would have found each other eventually," Alexander said, taking her hand. "But I'm grateful we didn't have to wait any longer than we did." As night fully descended on San Francisco, bringing the possibility of more unusual snowfall, Sophie reflected on the journey that had brought them here. One mistaken flight, one chance encounter, one second opportunity to create the family that circumstance had once denied them. Emma's birth certificate now properly listed Alexander Reid as her father, a legal formality that had brought unexpected tears to his eyes when the amended document arrived. Their home contained evidence of their unique path, a framed wrong boarding pass in the hallway, Emma's first passport with its London stamp, the rebuilt life Sophie had never anticipated when planning her Minneapolis escape. Some might call it fate or destiny, but Sophie preferred to think of it as resilience, the courage to recalibrate when life sent you to unexpected destinations, the wisdom to recognize when a detour might actually be the right path forward. "I love you," she said simply, the words still new enough to carry special weight between them, wrong flights and all. Alexander's answering smile contained everything they'd overcome and everything that still awaited them. "I love you too, and our final destination is just beginning." 5 years after that fateful wrong flight, Sophie and Alexander stood at Gate C-14 of Westbrook International Airport, each holding one of Emma's hands as she skipped between them. Now 6 years old, Emma wore a backpack shaped like a daisy and chatted excitedly about their upcoming vacation. "And Daddy said we might see dolphins, real ones, not just in books," she exclaimed, her hazel eyes, so like Alexander's, bright with anticipation. Sophie smiled, catching Alexander's gaze over their daughter's head. The matching gold bands on their left hands caught the sunlight streaming through the terminal windows. They'd married 2 years ago in a simple ceremony in Tessa's London flower shop, surrounded by white daisies and family who had once seemed lost to both of them. As they approached the gate, a young woman rushed past, clearly flustered, baby carrier, in one hand, boarding pass, fluttering in the other. "Excuse me," Alexander called, stopping her gently. "You might want to double-check your gate number. Easy mistake to make here." The woman paused, grateful for the intervention, and discovered she was indeed heading to the wrong gate. As she thanked them and hurried off in the correct direction, Emma looked up curiously. "Why did you help her, Daddy?" Alexander knelt to his daughter's level. "Sometimes the smallest gestures can change someone's entire journey, sweetheart. Just like how Mommy getting on the wrong plane changed our lives forever." "For the better," Sophie added softly. "Life rarely takes us where we expect, dear viewers. Sometimes we board the wrong flights, miss our connections, or arrive at unexpected destinations. But as Sophie and Emma and Alexander discovered, these detours can become the most beautiful journeys of all. If you believe in second chances and the magic of unexpected encounters, share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. Remember that wrong turns sometimes lead to the right people. Subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories of love, forgiveness, and the beautiful accidents that change our lives forever. Until next time, from all of us at Heartfelt Journey, may your own path be filled with wonderful surprises.